She needed a miracle. What she got was a contract. Grace Whitmore wasn't chasing dreams. She was just trying to stay afloat. Her nonprofit was gone. Her mother's heart was failing. Her little sister was counting on her. And then right when she was ready to give up, an email showed up. No sender name, no company, just an offer. $150,000 a year, no questions asked, live in, isolated, total confidentiality. What would you do if saving your family meant surrendering your freedom? She didn't know the man behind the offer. She didn't know he already knew everything about her. She didn't know love could come wrapped in power, silence, and regret. But this isn't a story about wealth. It's about the cost of being chosen before you ever got to choose. If you've ever wondered what you'd risk for someone you love, stay with this story. Let it sit with you. And if it touches something real, leave a comment, share it, and follow this channel for more stories that remind us sometimes the biggest decisions start with the smallest, quietest yes. Now, let's begin. This is She Was Just an Assistant Until a Billionaire Got on One Knee for Her. She thought she had hit a dead end, but the email in her spam folder had other plans. Grace Whitmore had always believed in quiet resilience, the kind that didn't ask for applause, didn't show up in headlines, and didn't expect the world to make space for it. She woke early, stayed late, and held things together the way her mother once did with lists, leftovers, and sheer will. She was 34, and lately, most mornings started with her staring out the small kitchen window of their modest Boulder home, coffee in hand, watching the neighbor's golden retriever chase birds across the frost-bitten yard. It was early winter in Colorado, and the chill seemed to seep deeper into the bones than usual that year. Or maybe that was just Grace tired in a way no amount of sleep could cure. Her job at a nonprofit and international relief agency had been more than just work. It was purpose. It was the thing that had kept her going after the heartbreak, after calling off the engagement 3 years ago, after moving back in to care for her mother and support her younger sister through nursing school, but purpose didn't always come with job security. And last week, a budget meeting that started with tight smiles ended with layoffs. Grace wasn't technically let go, but she was told her position was being reevaluated, which, in the nonprofit world, meant she had a few weeks to clear her desk. Still, she did what she always did. She held on. She made soup stretch for days. She canceled her gym membership, took on a few late-night grant writing gigs, and smiled at her mother each evening like everything would be fine. It wasn't fine. Her mother's heart medication had nearly doubled in price. Annie, her 22-year-old sister, was behind on tuition. And Grace, she was stuck in a life that felt paused, waiting for something, anything, to shift. So when she opened her email that Tuesday morning expecting more discount codes and rejection letters, she almost deleted the message without reading it. The subject line read, "Opportunity to Reconnect," from Samuel Grant. Her finger hovered over the trash icon. Samuel. It had been nearly 5 years. Back then, they were both working in Uganda on a rural health project. He was older, charming in a quiet, deliberate way, and always had a notebook tucked into his coat pocket. They had bonded over their shared love of folk music and overcomplicated spreadsheets. He had taken a job with a private foundation after their last project, and they'd lost touch. Grace clicked open the message. Grace, I hope this finds you well. I've followed your work over the years and always admired your steadiness under pressure. I'm reaching out on behalf of someone looking for a personal executive assistant. It's a unique position, one that requires discretion, commitment, and compassion. You were the first name that came to mind. The compensation is generous. The timeline is immediate. Let me know if you're open to learning more. Warmly, Samuel Grant. She read it 3 times. The words felt strange against the backdrop of her reality. Unpaid electric bills on the counter, a half-used bottle of generic cough syrup by the sink, and her mother humming off-key in the other room. Generous compensation. It might as well have said rescue mission. She wanted to ignore it, wanted to pretend she hadn't felt the flicker of hope it sparked. Grace didn't trust easy things. Not anymore. Still, she typed a reply. "Samuel, it's good to hear from you. I'd like to learn more. Best. Grace." She hit send, then exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for months. By that afternoon, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Grace Whitmore. The voice on the line was unmistakably Samuel's, measured, low, and still somehow warm. They spoke for 20 minutes. He didn't give a name, only referred to the client, but mentioned that the man lived remotely, worked in biomedical tech, and had requested someone capable of managing both logistics and personal discretion. "It's unconventional," Samuel had said, "but so is he." "And why me?" she asked, her voice steady but guarded. Samuel paused. "Because I know you won't fold under pressure, and because you care, even when no one's looking." It was the kindest thing anyone had said to her in a long time. By the end of the call, she had an address, a date, and a contract NDA in her inbox. The meeting was in 2 days. She sat for a long time after hanging up, the phone resting against her leg. The kettle whistled. Her mother coughed from the other room. Outside, snow began to fall, soft and steady, layering the neighborhood in hush. Grace walked over to the kitchen table, pulled out her worn notebook, and began making a list, not of groceries or bills or medications, but of questions, real ones. What am I walking into? Why now? And can I trust a door that only opens when I have nothing left? She didn't know the answers, not yet. But she knew one thing when everything felt like it was ending. Sometimes it was really just the beginning. She had no idea this email would not just change her career, but everything she thought she knew about love. She expected a boardroom. What she got was a fortress in the snow. The directions had been precise, so precise it almost unnerved her. Turn off Route 36 at mile marker 217. Drive exactly 3.2 miles north on the gravel path. Use the keypad at the gate. Do not honk. Do not call. Just wait. It was early morning when Grace reached the base of the mountain. The Colorado sun had barely broken through the heavy clouds, and the snow from the night before still clung stubbornly to pine branches. Her breath formed ghosts in the air as she stepped out of her car to punch in the code Samuel had sent her. The gate opened without a sound. As she drove through, she couldn't help but feel the weight of quiet. This place didn't just keep the world out, it erased it. The road curved sharply, lined with dark evergreens that stood like sentinels. Then, like something out of a dream or a movie, she saw it. A home that wasn't just a home, but a compound. Sleek steel and glass framed the structure, rising from the snow like it belonged there. Modern and cold, but with a certain elegance. This wasn't the house of someone who needed people. It was the fortress of someone who had decided he didn't. A man in a black wool coat met her at the entryway. He didn't smile, just nodded. "Ms. Whitmore." She nodded back. "Mr. Callahan is waiting for you in the south wing. No welcome coffee, no handshake, just doors opening to silence." They walked down a long hallway lined with abstract art, clean white walls, and floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the surrounding forest. Every sound, the tap of her boots, the rustle of her coat, seemed too loud, like the house was holding its breath. When the man opened the final door, he stepped aside. "He's expecting you." Grace took a deep breath and stepped in. The room was spacious, minimalist, clinical. A large desk sat near the window. Behind it stood a man, back turned, hands in his pockets, staring out at the snow-covered landscape. He didn't speak right away, just stood there. Then, without turning around, he said, punctual, "That's a good start." His voice was deep, low, with a slight rasp as if he spoke only when necessary. He turned, and there he was, Henry Callahan. Grace had heard the name before, of course. Most people had. CEO of Callahan Biomed, youngest executive to ever lead a biotech company to Fortune 100 status. The kind of man usually seen in headlines or magazine covers, but this wasn't a man made for press photos. He looked tired, like someone who had slept with one eye open for years. Sharp jawline, dark hair that curled slightly at the ends, and eyes so pale they looked almost silver in the light. He didn't offer a smile or a chair. "Let's not waste each other's time," he said. "You've been vetted. Samuel vouches for you. I'm offering a position that's both simple and intrusive. If you take it, you'll be my personal assistant. You'll live on site. You'll handle my calendar, my travel, internal communications, and things that don't fall under any job description." Grace blinked. "Things, discretion is part of the salary," he replied, finally sitting behind the desk. "And before you ask, yes, the compensation is what Samuel mentioned. Perhaps more, depending on performance." She tried to stay composed. The number Samuel had floated during their call was staggering. It could pay off Annie's tuition, cover her mother's surgeries, and finally give Grace room to breathe for the first time in years. But money didn't erase red flags. "You don't want someone with corporate experience?" she asked carefully. "I've never been anyone's assistant." Henry leaned back. "I don't want someone trained to tell me what I want to hear. I want someone who knows how to listen, who understands boundaries, who isn't afraid of quiet." He said the last part like a challenge. Grace met his gaze. "I've spent most of my life in quiet." Something in his eyes flickered. Approval, maybe, or recognition. He nodded once, then opened a drawer, pulled out a slim folder, and slid it across the desk. "Standard contract. NDA is inside. Read it carefully. If you sign, you start tomorrow." She picked it up, flipped through, and there it was. Clause 17, total confidentiality regarding personal and professional matters. Non-disclosure applies beyond tenure. Breach results in immediate termination and legal action. Grace looked up. "This is intense." Henry's expression didn't change. "So is my life." For a moment, the silence between them stretched thin, like a thread pulled taut between two people who weren't quite strangers, but not yet anything else. Grace exhaled. She thought of her mother's medications, of Annie staying up at night trying to study and work double shifts, of herself drifting, invisible, tired of scraping by. She signed. She signed the contract, not knowing she was walking into a life built on silence and something much deeper. She lived in his world now, where routines were sacred and emotions were locked away. Grace moved in on a Thursday. Snow had fallen the night before, thick and heavy. It coated everything: trees, rooftops, even the long gravel drive that wound its way around the estate like a secret no one spoke of. Her assigned apartment was in the north wing, tucked behind the main structure, with a view of the tree line and just enough distance to pretend she had privacy. But privacy, she would soon learn, was relative. The place was sleek like the rest of the compound. Neutral tones, sharp angles, and state-of-the-art everything. Lights that responded to voice commands, floors that heated silently beneath bare feet. No creaky pipes, no mismatched furniture, no signs of life left behind. It was a house designed to be lived in, not to feel lived in. And that suited Henry Callahan just fine. Samuel had helped her get settled, showed her the control panels, the internal messaging system, and the custom scheduling app that managed Henry's day down to the minute. "He's a creature of habit," Samuel had said gently, placing a thick binder in her hands. "Learn the rhythm, and the rest will follow." The rhythm, as it turned out, was relentless. Henry rose at 5:00 sharp. Coffee. Black. A silent lap around the inner perimeter of the estate. Then straight into meetings, lab briefings, investor calls, research reports. He moved through his day with military precision. No wasted time. No small talk. No deviation. Grace's job was to stay ahead of him, to anticipate, to absorb friction before it reached him. At first, it was overwhelming. She fielded international calls in the middle of the night, tracked grant reports, filtered hundreds of emails. She learned to sync his devices, decode his shorthand, and handle calls from CEOs twice her age without stammering. By the end of her first week, she knew the names of his board members, his favorite protein bar, and the fact that he always carried 2 pens, one for contracts, one for notes. What she didn't know was what made him laugh, or if he ever had. There were no family photos in his office, no personal mementos, no signs of a past that wasn't tied to achievement. She saw him for hours every day, and yet she didn't know him. One night, after finishing a report for a biomedical conference he was sponsoring, Grace passed by the main lab hallway on her way back to her apartment. It was almost midnight. She paused. There he was, still at his desk. Same pressed shirt, same posture, same pale light casting long shadows against the wall. He hadn't moved in hours. His face was unreadable, focused but worn, like a man trying to outrun something only he could see. She stood there for a moment too long, and just as she was about to walk away, he looked up. Their eyes met. He didn't frown, didn't scold, just nodded once, slowly, a silent acknowledgement. It wasn't warmth, not exactly, but it wasn't ice either. Grace returned to her room that night with the oddest feeling, that she had witnessed something she wasn't supposed to, that even a fortress of steel and code had soft spots if you knew where to look. The next morning, she found a note tucked under her door. It wasn't signed. "Good work on the Geneva proposal. I liked how you simplified the data." H, just 2 lines, but they stayed with her all day. In the weeks that followed, her days settled into a rhythm. Mornings started before the sun. Her tasks ranged from the mundane organizing supply shipments to the unexpectedly delicate declining dinner invitations from board members, managing tax filings for research properties, arranging transport for a bioethics panel in Zurich. But there was something more beneath it all, a hush in the air. The estate was staffed, but sparsely. 2 security personnel rotated shifts, and a groundskeeper she saw only once. Most of the time, it was just her and Henry. And the silence. No music. No casual conversations. No one dropping by. It was a life of function, not feeling. And yet, every so often, she'd catch him watching the snow fall with a stillness that felt almost longing. One evening, while inputting lab donor reports, she discovered a spreadsheet of anonymous donations, millions quietly funneled into pediatric research, mental health programs, and refugee medical care. None of it bore his name. She looked up, surprised, and in that moment, she realized this wasn't a man without a heart. This was a man who didn't know how to show it anymore, but even the most guarded walls eventually show their cracks. In the dark, truths have a way of slipping out. The storm rolled in without warning. At first, it was just a soft hush against the windows, the way snow always begins quiet and unsuspecting. But by evening, the wind had turned wild, howling through the pine trees like it had a story of its own to scream. By midnight, the power was gone. The estate had backup generators, of course, but even they blinked under the weight of the storm. For the first time since she'd arrived, the place felt vulnerable. The polished silence turned into real silence. No hum of systems, no flicker of automated lights. Just darkness, and the sound of winter pressing in from all sides. Grace had tried to stay calm. She lit one of the emergency lanterns and wrapped herself in a heavy wool throw, sitting by the window, watching snow swallow the courtyard outside. That's when there was a knock. Not from the front door, from the inner hallway. She opened the door slowly, and there was Henry. No coat, no tablet. Just a flashlight in hand and a weariness in his eyes that looked older than it should have been. "The generator's down," he said simply. "May take hours to fix." She nodded. "Are you all right?" He paused, then tilted his head toward the hallway. "Come on. There's a fireplace in the West Lounge." The lounge was a room she hadn't seen before: deep leather chairs, shelves of forgotten books, and a fireplace that came to life with just a spark from a match. They sat across from each other, two figures caught in a flickering circle of light while the storm roared outside like an angry thing. For a while, neither spoke. And then, without prompting, Henry leaned back and said, "Her name was Elise." The words were quiet, unhurried, like he wasn't even sure he meant to say them out loud. Grace looked up. "My wife," he added. "She died 7 years ago." Grace didn't move, didn't speak. "I met her before all this," he continued, gesturing vaguely at the room, the world he'd built. Before the company, the press, the expectations, she was studying environmental medicine. Brilliant, soft-spoken. She laughed with her whole face. There was a heaviness in his voice now, not dramatic, but dense, like stone. She had a heart condition, rare, genetic. We tried everything. Trials, surgeries. Nothing worked. Grace swallowed, the lump in her throat rising with his every word. I threw everything I had at the problem. Money, labs. I even opened a foundation in her name just to fund treatments that might reach her in time. But he looked away. The firelight danced on the side of his face. She died 2 days before the trial drug was approved. Silence. Deep. Unapologetic. Grace found her voice only after a pause. "I'm sorry." Henry nodded once, but didn't respond. She waited long enough for the moment to settle, then offered her own story. "I was engaged once," she said, 3 years ago. His eyes flicked up to meet hers. He was a family friend. Stable. Kind. We made sense on paper, but as the wedding got closer, I realized he didn't love me, not the way I needed to be loved. Henry tilted his head. Curious. I wasn't his person. She continued. I was his solution. To loneliness, to expectations. He told me I was the right kind of woman, like I was a safe bet, not a partner. A soft breath escaped her lips. I walked away 6 weeks before the wedding. My mother cried for days. My sister called me selfish, but I couldn't marry someone who wanted me because I fit a mold. There it was, her truth, out in the open, laid bare like a page in a journal, left open by mistake. The storm outside pressed harder. Wind rattled the windows, but the fire between them didn't flinch. And something shifted. No declarations, no dramatic music, just a stillness in the room that hadn't been there before. He looked at her, really looked, and for the first time, his gaze wasn't guarded. There was something softer now, warmer, like a door that had always been closed had been left just slightly ajar. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. But something passed between them that didn't need words. For the first time, the silence between them felt less like distance and more like possibility. Some things don't need to be said out loud to be felt deeply. Something had shifted. Grace couldn't name it, not exactly, but she felt it in the way mornings seemed softer, in the way Henry no longer checked his watch during conversations, and in the silence between them that no longer felt so heavy. Since the night of the storm, the walls had changed, not the ones made of stone and glass, the ones between two people who had long forgotten how to let others in. It began with small things. One morning, as she reviewed funding proposals in the shared workspace, Henry approached with a cup of tea, not coffee, not a command, just tea. "You mentioned you liked Earl Grey," he said simply, placing it beside her without another word. Another day. She returned from a walk to find her favorite piece of classical music, Debussy's Clair de Lune, playing gently through the estate's sound system. She had never told him, but he had noticed once when it came on in the background of her laptop during a late-night report session. And then there were the decisions. He started involving her, not just for logistics, but for judgment. What do you think of this foundation? Would this grant actually make a difference? Is this organization real, or just well-marketed? At first, she thought it was a test, but over time, she realized he was listening, not just hearing her, listening. One afternoon, as they walked the perimeter of the property, fresh snow crunching underfoot, air crisp with the scent of pine, he asked her what it was like growing up without a father. The question was quiet, gentle, and she answered without defense. And when she asked him what it was like to be known by the world, but understood by no one, he didn't flinch. They walked in silence after that, but it was a silence that held something delicate, something becoming. Grace found herself laughing more, sleeping better. She even caught herself humming in the kitchen one morning, something she hadn't done in years. And yet, with every step toward closeness, she also felt a flicker of fear. What if she was reading too much into this? What if kindness was just kindness? What if her heart, worn thin by years of putting others first, was mistaking comfort for love? She told herself to be cautious, to remain professional, to remember that this was a job, a temporary arrangement. But her hand still trembled slightly when his brushed hers while passing a report. And her breath still caught in her throat when she heard him laugh, not the polite kind, but the real one. That escaped when she least expected it. It was both beautiful and terrifying. Until one evening, everything changed. She was organizing grant documentation in the archive room, cataloging older donations and digitalizing paper files. Most of it was routine contracts, thank you letters, medical reports. But then, tucked behind a misfiled envelope, she saw it. A red folder, unlabeled, plain. She almost didn't open it, but something about it felt intentional, or maybe forgotten in a way that begged to be remembered. Inside were documents, familiar ones. Photos of her mother at the hospital, of Annie, studying at the university cafe 2 towns over, notes, dates, schedules, even medical records, her own. She stared in disbelief. There were printouts of emails she'd written to nonprofits 3 years ago, a copy of the volunteer sign-in sheet from the first time she and Samuel had worked together, a scanned letter she'd written to a funding board that had been rejected. None of this was public, not even online. Her heart raced. The room suddenly felt colder. This wasn't casual due diligence. This was surveillance. She sat down slowly, the folder open across her lap, eyes tracing every line, every timestamp. And then she saw it. A note handwritten in the margin of one page. Grace Whitmore, worth the risk. Her throat tightened. Was this before the job? Before the email from Samuel, had she ever really applied for this position at all? Suddenly, the comfort she'd felt over the past few weeks, every shared tea, every silent walk, every unspoken moment took on a new weight. Had he chosen her or orchestrated her? And then she found the folder. What she found wasn't just about her. It was about everything she thought was hers to choose. Grace had never been one to snoop. She believed in boundaries, emotional and physical. But sometimes a door opens by accident, or maybe by design. It was late afternoon, and she was alone in Henry's upper study, helping Samuel catalog older files from philanthropic projects that predated the current digital system. She had always loved this room, the smell of old paper, the creak of wooden floors, and the way the high windows caught golden mountain light. It was one of the few spaces Henry rarely entered, tucked away from the rest of the estate, nearly forgotten. She knelt beside a tall row of oak filing cabinets, searching for a report Samuel had requested. One drawer after another revealed little just dusty folders, expense sheets, donor lists from over a decade ago, until she reached the bottom left corner. The drawer had a small, subtle lock, but oddly, it wasn't fastened. She pulled gently, a soft click. It slid open with ease. Inside was a single item, a red leather folder. Her breath caught. It was too clean, too recent, not part of the rest. And it matched the one she'd found days earlier in the archive room, the one that already haunted her with its quiet implications. This one, though, this one was heavier. Her fingers hesitated at the edge of the cover, pulse rising. She glanced around the quiet room. No footsteps, no voices, just the sound of her own breath. She opened it. The first page was a medical invoice from Boulder Regional Hospital Cardiology Department. It was dated 8 months ago. Her mother's name printed at the top in bold. Below it, stamped clearly, paid in full. Next, a pharmacy receipt for heart medication. Then another, from a specialist, all covered, all anonymous, all signed by H.C. Her hands began to tremble. Then came a tuition summary. University of Colorado, Annie's full academic year, paid through a private educational grant. Again, unsigned, but linked to a foundation Grace now remembered Henry had donated to quietly. She turned the next page and froze. It was a photo of her, sitting alone at the cafe near her mother's hospital, wearing the green scarf she always wore on hard days. Her eyes were tired, expression unreadable, taken from a distance but clearly intentional. The next photo showed her outside the shelter, mid-laugh, handing supplies to a man in a coat too thin for the season. Others followed, all candid, all quiet, all from before she had ever set foot on Henry Callahan's property. At the very back of the folder, tucked into a slip of paper, was a single note. It was written in careful, deliberate handwriting she knew well now. His handwriting. She deserves better. Maybe I can be that someday. That was it. No grand confession, no manipulation, just a sentence. Her chest tightened as she sat back in the worn leather chair, eyes unfocused, folder open in her lap. She had been chosen, not interviewed. She had been observed, not discovered. And worst of all, she had believed it had been fate. A kind email, a desperate opportunity. But now it felt like something else. Like her life had been guided by unseen hands all along. How many moments had he orchestrated? How many decisions had he made on her behalf, believing he was helping? And when did kindness become control? She stared at the folder again. This wasn't just data. It was her mother, her sister, her daily rituals, her sacrifices, her hopes. And yet, woven into it all was a tenderness she didn't know what to do with. He had helped, generously, quietly, without asking for recognition, but not without watching, not without choosing. For someone like Henry, who had lost so much, who operated in silence and shadows, maybe this was his way of connecting, of reaching out. But for Grace, it blurred the lines of everything she thought she could trust. Her fingers brushed the note again. She deserves better. Maybe I can be that someday. Had she been part of a plan, or had she simply been seen in a way no one else had ever seen her? She didn't know which truth would hurt more. Grace closed the folder carefully, as if afraid the contents would disappear if she blinked. She placed it back in the drawer, but didn't lock it. The questions inside were too heavy for a lock to hold. She stood, her knees stiff, and looked out the tall windows. The snow had begun to fall again, quiet and slow. The landscape below was white, serene, and unknowing. But Grace knew, and she couldn't carry this silence alone. She had to ask him, even if the answer would break her heart. Did you choose me or design me? The folder felt heavier in her hands than its contents could explain. Grace sat in her quarters long after the fire had died down, the room dim but not dark. Her heart beat slow, almost dull, but beneath it churned something sharp: betrayal, grief, confusion. She had walked into Henry Callahan's world thinking she'd earned her place. That, perhaps. Finally, someone had recognized her work, her quiet efforts, and offered her a lifeline. But now she wasn't so sure it had been recognition. It felt more like orchestration. The next morning, she didn't wait for a convenient moment. She walked through the main house, past the breakfast set Samuel had laid out but left untouched, and found Henry in his library, seated at his desk, glasses low on his nose, pen in hand. He looked up when she entered, expression neutral. But something in his posture shifted. "Good morning," he said gently. "Did you sleep? Did you choose me?" Grace said, her voice calm but unwavering. "Or did you design me?" Henry didn't blink. He placed his pen down slowly, folded his glasses, and sat back. "I was wondering when you'd ask." That folder. She stepped closer, her hands trembling despite her effort to appear steady. My mother's hospital bills, Annie's tuition, photographs taken without my knowledge. You knew everything before I even got that email from Samuel. He nodded once, a small, solemn gesture. Yes. Grace's throat tightened. So it wasn't fate, she said bitterly. It was a strategy. Henry stood, but didn't move closer. I saw you years ago, Grace, long before Samuel ever mentioned your name. I saw the way you worked at the food banks, the shelters. I read your grant proposals. I followed the outcomes of the projects you managed. Every time, it was your name that stood out, not just for results, but for heart. Then why hide? Her voice cracked. Why pretend it was just a job opportunity? Because I didn't know how to be honest about wanting something or someone. His voice was low, gravelly now. I've lived too long behind walls. After Marianne died, I built everything I have around the belief that if I just controlled enough variables, no one I cared about would ever be lost again. He took a breath, like the truth pained him. But you weren't a variable. You were the one thing I couldn't predict. Grace looked at him, this man who had lived like a ghost in his own home, offering the world solutions while guarding his own heart like a vault. "I thought you trusted me," she whispered. "I do?" "No," she said, firmer now. "You trusted me to manage your calendar, your mail, your systems, but you didn't trust me with choice. You made every decision for me before I ever knew your name. I was trying to help. No, you were trying to control, and you dressed it up as care." The silence between them wasn't empty. It was brimming with things they both wanted to say and were terrified to admit. Henry looked at her, then really looked. His face not the composed mask he usually wore, but something closer to grief. "I didn't know how to love someone the right way anymore." "Grace," he said softly. "So I tried to make it safer. For you, for me, for all of it." Her eyes burned, but she held back the tears. "You didn't choose me," she said, the words leaving her mouth like ice. "You built a case around me." She turned then, walked slowly toward the doorway. And still he didn't follow. Not a single word to stop her, not a single step forward, because maybe deep down he knew this was the price of his silence, of his need for control, of his inability to open the door without a blueprint in hand. Grace stepped outside. The wind met her cheeks with the kind of cold that made you feel awake in your bones. But at least out here, she could breathe. Back inside. Henry remained by the fireplace, unmoving. He heard the click of the front door, the soft tread of boots fading down the path. And then nothing. Just the slow tick of the old grandfather clock in the corner and the fire whispering down to embers. In the silence that followed, he realized he might have just lost her for good. Some truths are easier to write than to say. It had been 12 days since Grace left the mountain. In Boulder, spring was slowly thawing the edges of winter. Sidewalks were still lined with patches of snow that refused to melt, clinging like old memories. Grace had slipped easily back into the rhythm of her old life, returning to her volunteer work at the food bank, organizing fundraising efforts for struggling families, walking home from the center with grocery bags in both arms and silence as her only companion. But something in her had shifted. The silence no longer felt like a refuge. It felt unfinished. Her mother's health had stabilized. Annie, now with her tuition fully covered, was thriving at college. They both believed Grace had simply taken a well-paying temporary job and returned. She didn't tell them about Henry. Not yet. Some stories were too heavy for casual conversation. Some heartbreaks too intimate to name. Then, one afternoon, Samuel showed up at the food bank. He was standing by the back entrance, holding a small envelope and a brown paper-wrapped package like something out of another time. "I didn't know if I should bring this," he said quietly, "but I think you deserve to see it." Inside the envelope was a letter, in Henry's handwriting. The package was a flash drive. She didn't open either until hours later, sitting at her small kitchen table with the kettle on the stove hissing low. She opened the letter first. It was brief. "Grace, if you're reading this, it means Samuel has decided to ignore my request and give you the message anyway. He always had a stronger sense of hope than I did. I don't know if I deserve your forgiveness. I may never know. But if I could go back, I wouldn't undo the care I tried to give your family only the way I went about it. There are things I couldn't say to your face without it sounding like justification, but I hope, at the very least, you can believe this. I never planned to fall in love with you, and I didn't realize I had until it was too late. I wish I had trusted you with the truth sooner. H." Her hands trembled as she unfolded the note a second time. Then she plugged in the flash drive. The video was simple. No production, no flourish, just Henry Callahan in his study, seated in the same leather chair where they had last spoken. His hair was more unkempt, his tie loosened, his voice stripped of all pretense. "This isn't a speech. I've had enough of those." He let out a long breath. "By the time you see this, you've probably made your choice, and I respect it. I resigned from the board last week. I've sold my majority stake. I don't want to run things from behind walls anymore." He reached down, picked up a folder, the same kind she once found in his drawer. "I've started a foundation, the Whitmore Health Fund. It's named after your mother, not because I wanted credit, but because she represents everything I overlooked. Quiet resilience, care that isn't about control." He looked up, eyes raw and unguarded. "This isn't a request. I'm not asking you to come back. I'm just telling you that, if you ever choose to, I'll be here, not with conditions, not with contracts. Just me, and whatever's left of the man you once trusted." The video ended there. No goodbye. Just the soft sound of the chair creaking as he leaned back, and the screen faded to black. Grace sat still for a long time, her fingers resting on the keyboard. There was no anger in her chest now, just a still ache like a bruise from something deeper than harm. She thought about the man who built walls from pain, and slowly, painfully, had started to dismantle them, not for praise, but because loving someone truly meant letting go of control. The kettle screamed softly behind her. Grace didn't get up to turn it off, not yet, because she knew what waited now wasn't a plan, or a job offer, or a calculation. It was a choice. And for the first time in this whole story, it was fully hers. Grace stood at the threshold of a choice only she could make. He didn't follow. He didn't call. He simply waited, and that made all the difference. The invitation arrived quietly, no courier, no dramatic flourish. Just a plain envelope slipped into her mailbox on an ordinary Thursday morning. Grace turned it over in her hands, sensing its weight before she even opened it. Inside, on thick paper stock, were a few simple words printed in serif type. "You are warmly invited to the dedication of the Whitmore Community Medical Center. April 23rd, 10 juror no speeches, no press, just thanks. No sender, no signature, no explanation." But she knew exactly who had sent it. Grace hadn't seen Henry Callahan in nearly 2 months. Not since the confrontation in his office, not since the letter Samuel had given her, not since the grainy video where he spoke more truth than he ever had in person. She had played that video only once. That was all it took. And then she tucked it away, along with the ring he hadn't offered and the words he hadn't said aloud. Because sometimes the most honest things are the ones left unsaid. The morning of the dedication. Grace dressed slowly, not because she wanted to impress anyone, but because it mattered. The moment mattered. She chose a soft blue blouse, one her mother had always said brought out the light in her eyes. She pinned her hair up, simple and neat, and added a pair of pearl earrings she hadn't worn in years. As she left the house, she paused at the photograph on the hallway shelf. Her mother, smiling in a hospital gown, holding Annie's hand, alive, whole, because of Henry, and because of love, however messy, however flawed, that had taken root in the most unlikely of places. The Whitmore Community Medical Center stood at the northern edge of Boulder, nestled against a gentle rise in the land where wildflowers had just begun to bloom. It wasn't grand in the traditional sense, no marble columns, no sweeping architecture, but it was warm. Wooden beams curved gently across the ceilings. Floor-to-ceiling windows brought sunlight into every hallway. The entrance bore no logos, no names in bronze, just a carved sign that read, for every heart that waited. Grace stood outside the main doors for a long moment, fingers curled around the strap of her bag, steadying herself. She wasn't sure what she expected: crowds, cameras, maybe even speeches after all. But what she saw instead was stillness. Just a few local staff, a handful of volunteers, a couple families with children in tow. No ceremony, no stage. And beyond the garden, near a tall cottonwood tree, stood Henry. He wore a gray wool coat, no tie, no security, no one at his side. He didn't move when he saw her. He didn't wave. He simply waited, and somehow that said more than any apology ever could. Grace crossed the gravel slowly, heart pounding against her ribs. She half expected him to speak as she approached, to say something rehearsed or formal. But he didn't. Instead, when she stopped in front of him, Henry reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, worn, frayed slightly at the corners. He looked down at it, not opening it yet. Then, with quiet steadiness, he spoke. "It's strange," he said, "how long I've lived behind gates and glass, and it took losing you to realize that all that protection wasn't protecting anything that mattered." Grace said nothing. She didn't need to. "This center, this place, it's not about making up for what I did. It's just the first thing I've ever built that wasn't about me." Then he opened the box. Inside was a ring, not new, not polished. A modest diamond set in a vintage band, slightly scuffed along the edges. "It was my mother's," he said softly. "She wore it through everything: loss, rebuilding, raising me alone. It's not perfect, but it carries the kind of love that survives." And then, before she could say a word, Henry slowly lowered himself to one knee. There were no cameras, no applause, just the wind shifting through the cottonwood leaves and the hush of spring. "This time," he said, voice raw, "I'm not hiring you. I'm not controlling the terms. I'm not asking for your loyalty." He looked up, eyes clearer than she'd ever seen them. "I'm asking for your heart. And I'll wait, Grace, for as long as it takes." Grace stood there, tears gathering quietly in her eyes. The woman who once thought she had no choices was now being offered the only one that truly mattered. Not because of a job, not because of desperation, but because love, real love, had waited. She knelt down beside him, not out of ceremony, but out of understanding. Two people finally on the same ground. She reached for the ring, and this time, she placed it on her own hand. And just like that, the story they had both been too afraid to write began. Not every fairy tale begins in a castle. Some start in silence and end with a choice. The house they chose wasn't large. It sat at the edge of Lyons, Colorado, just beyond the cafe, where the locals still baked pies from scratch, and close enough to the river that spring melt could be heard from the porch. It was a modest craftsman with wide front steps, a red door that always creaked a little, and a kitchen that smelled of cinnamon more often than not. There was no staff, no cameras, no locked drawers, just Grace and Henry, learning slowly, gently, how to live without the armor they had once believed was essential. He sold the estate months before the wedding that never happened. There was no press release, no headlines. The headlines had come and gone long ago when Henry Callahan stepped down from his company, handed over the reins, and vanished from the world of conferences and quarterly earnings. People speculated. Then they moved on. But Grace knew. He didn't vanish. He returned to something real. They kept busy. Grace took over the operations of the Whitmore Foundation, which funded small-town medical centers, community food banks, and scholarships for first-generation college students. Annie, now a third-year med student, managed a program that matched rural clinics with under-resourced student interns. Henry handled the numbers, the strategy, the calls with donors who still couldn't quite believe the man they once called a machine now took meetings in flannel shirts and never asked about ROI. He didn't need control anymore. He just needed purpose. Evenings were sacred. They didn't make a rule about it. They just fell into a rhythm that felt like home. Dinners on the back porch when weather allowed, jazz on the old record player, the occasional hum of the dishwasher and the sound of Grace's fingers brushing along the spine of a book before bed. No contract, no conditions, no secrets, just a kind of quiet love that didn't need proving anymore. Sometimes they laughed about at the beginning. Remember the security forms Grace once teased, passing him the salt? All 17 pages of them. Henry smiled, eyes crinkling. I still can't believe you didn't run after the second clause. But, truthfully, she had run, and somehow he had stayed still enough for her to find her way back. They didn't wear wedding bands. They didn't feel the need. Commitment, they learned, wasn't forged in ceremony. It was built in the morning coffee he always brewed a little too strong because he knew she liked it that way. It was found in the way Grace folded Henry's reading glasses into the quilt at night because he always forgot where he left them. It was stitched into Saturday mornings at the farmer's market, where people still didn't recognize them, but sometimes stopped to compliment how easily they walked, in step. Samuel visited often. He'd retired officially, but couldn't seem to stay away. He brought fresh jam from his wife's kitchen and teased Henry endlessly. You used to measure everything in risk models. Now you're over there picking basil like it's a national security matter. Henry only smiled. Even Ellen. Grace's mother, once frail and hospital-bound, now took afternoon strolls with Annie when she came home from school. Her health had stabilized. Her spirit had returned. I don't understand how all of this happened, she whispered to Grace one night, touching the wood of the front porch. But it feels like the world gave me back more than I ever lost. Then came that morning. Just like any other sky pale blue. Birds arguing over the feeder. Henry at the kitchen counter reading the Denver Post. Grace sat at the table, cradling her tea. The sunlight made a slow path across the floor. She looked at him, really looked. His hair was longer now, always a little mussed. He wore that old wool sweater she had once threatened to toss out, but now couldn't bear to. He glanced up. "What is it?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. She let the stillness settle between them. Then, softly, she said, "I finally feel like I belong somewhere." Henry blinked, unsure if he'd misheard. "Not because of who you are," Grace continued, voice steady, "but because of who I get to be beside you." Silence. Then Henry lowered the paper, folded it carefully, set it aside. He reached for her hand, held it like it was a promise, not a possession. "That's all I ever wanted," he said, "not to save you, not to keep you, just to walk beside you, however far you'd let me." And she did, every step of the way. They never became famous again. The world forgot the billionaire who built a mountain estate, and the woman who once said no to everything it came with. But in that quiet little town, people remembered them differently, as the couple who held hands in the produce aisle, as the ones who always left 2 extra cartons of eggs for the food pantry, as the pair who laughed softly during town meetings and always sat in the back pew on Sunday. They didn't need a castle. They had a home. It wasn't the ending anyone expected. No fairy tale fanfare, no sweeping declarations, just a man who learned to wait, and a woman who learned to be chosen for all the right reasons, and in that choice, They found the life they had waited a lifetime for. Together. Sometimes, life doesn't present us with clear paths, only difficult choices. Grace's journey reminds us that the most powerful decisions are often the quietest ones showing up when you're exhausted. Choosing trust after betrayal. Loving again after loss. We often think of love as grand gestures or perfect timing. But real love, the kind that heals, happens in the in-between. In shared silences. In forgiveness given without being asked. In staying when it's easier to walk away. Henry learned that control is not connection, and that vulnerability is not weakness. Grace discovered that being chosen means little if you can't choose back. This story invites us to reflect, have we allowed life's disappointments to close our hearts, or are we still willing to risk being open even when we've been hurt before? Because sometimes the second chapter is better than the first. Not because it's easier, but because we've grown stronger, softer, and wiser with time. So, no matter your age, remember, it's never too late to choose again. And sometimes, the best kind of love is the one we never saw coming. Thank you so much for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart, even just a little, please, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us continue telling stories that heal, connect, and remind us of the quiet strength we all carry inside. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Until next time, take gentle care of yourself and those you love.